Mr. Barnes, it is an absolute delight to see you again, and you are working on yet another project to gift the world with. I enjoyed Missing Axioms so much. There was so much insight in it, the elegance, the philosophical dexterity that you always wield, and it's present all over again in the Iconoclast. So thank you so much for gifting the world with that. How have you been, Mr. Barnes? You've been doing all right?
I'm great. Yeah, I'm. This next project's it kind of started off pretty amorphous, and I've doubted myself along the way, but I feel like these last couple months it's really starting to come together as something a bit more coherent, so that's good.
Well, all good projects are, the great projects tend to be so large and important and dealing with so much that they can start off with that uncertainty of what's there, but that's just evidence of the importance of it. And I'm so thrilled to be hearing that you feel like it's coming together. I've enjoyed your recent entries. What would you say if I would ask you if I bumped into you on the street and met you and said, oh, well, you said the Iconoclast, and I was like, oh, well, what's that about? What is that? What's going on? What would you say to that person on the sidewalk?
Yeah, instead of getting straight into the more abstract definitions, I feel like it's good to sort of preface, and I'm planning to preface the book with this fact, is that when you become interested in philosophy, whether it's like interest or something that completely consumes you, you often ask like, why are you doing that? What's the point, right? And I always found myself answering with some vague answer that you normally get from the sort of what is philosophy books or essays or whatever, right? When you're like, oh, it's an account of life, or what it means to be good, or what's at the base of all things. But then I realized that actually I think all encompassing and hard problems are the most compelling things in life, right? And the most all encompassing and most difficult problem I could find was philosophy, basically. And again, this comes to the central thesis of the book, which is the uniqueness of philosophy, which is that, and I call it the meta question, because it's sort of the question of all questions. It's the intellectual field of intellectual fields, if you will. My proof for that is that there is a philosophy of X for every single X. There is the philosophy of science, there's philosophy of art. You can get as ridiculous with that as you want, but basically philosophy is the only thing that can examine everything, but also can only examine itself. For example, because physics starts with an empirical foundation and certain presuppositions, physics can't interrogate itself. However, there is a philosophy of physics, right? There's a philosophy of science at the higher level than that. So that's the central thesis of the book. There's a couple of things that come along from that, but that is the main point I wanted to get at with this.
Oh, I love it. Well, in the first one, we talk about the meta question, on this idea that all questions basically kind of start with philosophy. In the beginning, there is the question. In a sense, the question is philosophy. What is this thing that can philosophize about itself? And that also can have a sub-question, if I'm getting the language correctly, in all these other different fields. And it is fascinating, right? You can think of the philosophy of relationships, the philosophy of physics. Every PhD, the P in PhD is philosophy, right? So this love of wisdom. And but what's so interesting is the love of wisdom also, to truly be a real love of wisdom, also has to examine itself. Like when you talk about kind of in relationships, a relationship is not simply a one-way street where you examine the other person and think about, how they fit with you, but you also look at yourself to kind of determine who you are and your place in the relationship. And it's so interesting that philosophy is unique in kind of figuring out the philosophy of itself. It's funny, the other thing that's similar, but is not that doesn't examine itself like that, I was talking with Dawood and John, is the notion of you can have a story of the story of a relationship, the story of a home, the story of the color blue, the story of philosophy, all these different things. But stories are lived, stories are things you kind of experience, that you go through, whereas the philosophy is the process of understanding the world that you are in, and that you really don't engage in full understanding of the world unless you go into philosophy. And it's so important to realize that, because it's almost as if, and I'd be curious what you think of this, it's almost as if it's so difficult to answer the question, what is philosophy, precisely because you're doing it all the time. In some respects, you may just not be doing it well. Like if I ask you, how was your day? there's a sense in which you could answer that by saying good, or you can say, well, how is my day? What is a day? Was it good? What is the word good? You could take that question and kind of expand on it in interesting ways. And yet, we're always kind of engaging in this mode. I guess you could at least say we're always in a mode that at the drop of a hat could be philosophical. Like there's never a moment in our lives where we couldn't instantly turn it into a philosophical moment. Like even if I'm eating a meal, like I go into the kitchen, I'm having lunch, I could even turn that into like, why do I even bother to have lunch? Why do I want to continue to live? It's kind of interesting to think that at any moment, any second of an experience, you could actually flip it and look at it through a philosophical lens. And it's hard to think about being able to do that with any other field. Like I was saying, I read your piece on the meta question and I was downstairs searching the cabinets for a container of tuna, with hot sauce. It's not bad. And I was thinking about, I really can't think of what I am doing right now in terms of biology or chemistry or any of these different things, but I can't think of it philosophically. Why do I even want to eat? Why do I even want to keep going? Just even these little mundane experiences. And I found it just very interesting after reading your work to really kind of go, I'm always 1 second away from entering into a philosophical inquiry. And that seems unique to me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. This is possibly why it connects to Missing Axioms, because the point is that this whatever this thing is that I believe has us captured in some way, has us, as I say in Missing Axioms, spewing out these philosophical judgments, whether you like them or not, right? You not thinking about it just because you're hungry or whatever and going to get the tuna, that you're already making philosophical judgments without having to, as you say, stop. But I would think more accurate to say suspending your judgment, right?
Mm.
And then thinking cognitively about these things.
I like that, because you've already actually judged that, right? From it, like you've already kind of judged that it's worth getting the tuna, even though you haven't actually thought about it. So that's nice. So you're actually suspending your judgment.
Right. Because I mean, this is one of the things that Hume brings up, is that there are, there's things going on in reality, and like the way we look at it is like emanating these judgments, and a lot of them are empirical, a lot of them are abstract, but regardless, they're philosophical judgments, right?
Right.
So we've got this meta question, right, which I don't think is even like a superset. It's something that we almost like can't understand, because we're not quite capable of that sort of pure philosophizing, whatever that even means. I don't know. Whatever this philosophy means, we're possibly not even capable of that. But basically, going back to physics, for example, as soon as we assume certain things, such as in physics case, metaphysical materialism and empirical study, you've already made a sub question there, right? And that's a sub part of this meta question, right? And it's distinct from other sub questions. For example, instead of metaphysical materialism, you could have some sort of metaphysical supernaturalism, and then you've got a sub question of religion, for example. So that's my kind of theory on that. And it seems like a lot of the ways we think require us to think within a sub question, because it's very difficult to think without those axiomatic presuppositions or boundaries that are the meta question. And this is kind of one of the journeys I take through the book. At least currently, I'm looking at Thoreau, the old skeptic. But obviously, I'm looking at him through Sextus Empiricus, because that's all we have on him, unfortunately, pretty much. And then Hume as well, which I think, and again, this is an example of just where academic philosophy has largely failed, which is, I went through a master's course in philosophy, and I just, from what I was assigned and what I read, just assumed he was a very, blank empiricist talking about cause and effect. Then you sort of read a bit between the lines of what he was writing, and there's so much more to Hume than that. And he's almost like the inheritor to like Pharoneism, like what the skeptics were talking about. He seems to be like the inheritor of that, and getting away from the certain kind of thinking that was going on the continent at the time. And then I'm going to throw a few other kind of more wild card thinkers in there. I think one of my chapters right now is talking about Nietzsche, and people, you can describe Nietzsche as an iconoclast, right? But in what senses was he really iconoclastic in terms of, you know, getting rid of presuppositions and going out and venturing out intellectually into the meta question. So that's kind of my roadmap for where I'm going with this.
Well, that's magnificent. And you mentioned Hume. Hume is one of those thinkers that when you go, like, exactly, you go through college, you read some book, you hear what people say, and you go, oh, okay. And then you go back and you look and you go, do I have to reread everyone that I thought I understood? Because it's so different from what you heard. It kind of makes you paranoid. You're like, oh my gosh. It's like the first time I ran into the Grand Inquisitor section of Dostoevsky, I had a certain interpretation of it. But then later on, when I went back and read the Brothers Karamazov and saw how it fit into the entire book, and I will abstain from going into the subject. I was like, oh my gosh, my understanding of this has been totally wrong. Do I have to reread every book I ever read because I'm an idiot and don't actually know them and think I do? It makes you kind of a crazy person. But that in of itself is actually what philosophy can do. That sort of feeling of this revisiting or this sort of rethinking that I find very interesting, because it's almost like you can take that too far, but then you can also make a mistake by not doing it enough. Right? This is that fine, difficult balance we have to find. The other thing I wanted to say, what I found so lovely on this idea of philosophy as the meta question, is I had this kind of image in my mind when we were talking about the difference between sub-questions that are axiomatic, they're framed in a certain way, whereas philosophy, which seems to be the foundation of all of them, or the starting point of all of them, is almost like, I had this image of the word, the question, floating over this like black void, like in Genesis, like in the beginning, there was the question, and the question was everything. And on the first day, the question made physics, and on the second day it made chemistry. This kind of different thing, and this kind of idea of this free floating question that doesn't really have any pillars holding it up, and yet still somehow manages to float. And it doesn't sink into the water. There's nothing holding it, but it somehow is kind of levitating, to have this sort of image. And like you say, it may transcend human capacity to understand how this is possible, how something could float like that. So we have to immediately then turn to sub-questions that have axioms, that have pillars holding it up out of the water. Almost like in New Orleans, you have those those houses that have the pillars, the piles, I can't even think of the name, holding them up over the marshlands. That's what holds them up. Those are all the sub-questions, whereas philosophy is like this house floating over the marsh. Like, how is it doing that? That doesn't make any sense. And yet it does. It never falls in. It's this mysterious phenomenon. And one wonders, when the first man saw the lightning bolt, or, he saw the rock, or whatever, what's the first question that comes into his mind? Like, what is this? What do I do with this? It's hard to imagine the first man asking, what is the material composition of this rock, or something like that. It probably indeed was something that was more akin to a philosophical question, of which defined primitive, we can't do a Rousseauian or Hobbesian state of nature, or have Foucault talking about the lightning bolt that contained all language, or whatever, in the New Science. But there is, I can think of your child, I can definitely, let's put it this way. I can tell you for a fact that children do not start off scientists, they start off philosophers, because all my son does is ask me why, especially when I tell him not to do something. He's like, why, Dad? Why? That's going to be good to go outside. Like, what did I do? You went to go out at like midnight the other night or something like that? I was like, Haven, 1, you're supposed to be asleep. 2, you can't go out in the dark. He's like, why, Dad? It will teach me to be brave. Don't you want me to be brave? I'm like, oh my gosh, Haven, no. So all these kids kind of start off philosophy. There's something in children that is radically philosophical right from the get-go. And also, I will say, in that philosophical spirit, what I see happen is the philosophical spirit is what leads into the experimentation, because they're like, what is this? What is it? And then they throw it in the air and they want to see what it does, right? Like they throw the toy across the room at their sister because they want to see if it will hit her. They want to see if that experiment will work. So kind of they get very interested. Like Reed spends all of his time plugging stuff into the socket, into the wall, right? He examines, he's looking at it, he's very interested. And then the experiment comes from trying to answer the why question. But the why question leads into the experimentation, as opposed to, I don't see the children acting in a way that makes them experiment and then ask why. Now, of course, I don't have hard proof and can't bring you a peer-reviewed journal, but from just anecdotally, from experience, you see how children operate with this why. And it is funny. You're just kind of like, as a parent, you're sitting there going, where do they think of this stuff? Where does it come from? Why do they have these questions? It's really wild, the kind of questions that kids come up with. And you're just, and it feels like it was just the question there from birth, just there, mysteriously floating in them, that they have this tendency to come up with these questions and to ask these questions so easily. I couldn't help but when reading And then when reading what you were saying on the meta question, to really think that in my experience with children, it's there. It's this mysterious there already from birth.
Yeah, I think the example you gave of, the lightning bolt hitting the earth and there being fire all of a sudden is a good one, because it kind of, mentally speaking and intellectually speaking, opens up different pathways, right? Because there's two ways the caveman could go with that, right? There's either what thinking, or there's why thinking, right? And it feels to me like, what thinking and why thinking, as soon as you make an opinion on that, you've made an axiom, right? So if you're going to do what thinking and you're thinking about the material properties of this thing that is all of a sudden in front of you, you're embracing your empirical reality. But maybe if you go towards why thinking, you're like thinking about why was there a lightning bolt, why is there fire now? And then you get into different sub questions, like maybe it's a religious sub question where you're saying, oh, the lightning bolt came from Zeus or something like this. But that kind of, I think, leads us into the two intellectual modes I want to outline. The namesake of the book being the Iconoclast, and this is kind of, the way I'm thinking about it is like it's an intellectual archetype, but I'm not saying like it's an evidenced archetype or anything. It's just so the Iconoclast is sort of without presupposition, and the Dogmatist, which is the opposite of that, is with presupposition. So one the Iconoclast is the sort of denizen of the meta question, and the Dogmatist is the way we think when we're in sub questions, for example. I thought, but just besides the two intellectual modes, I thought your point about children's really interesting as well, because it's almost suggesting that the iconoclastic and that presupposition thinkers we have are children, and that certainly relates to Nietzsche as well. Nietzsche talks a lot about being childlike in our thinking to get away from superstition and all these sorts of things as well.
Oh, yeah, well, and just to add to it, there's a big difference between childish and childlike. A lot of people think that, you're childish, but the thing what Nietzsche's talking about, that this childlikeness, it brings to mind, I think it was Levinas who said something like, the point of the philosopher is to make the ordinary strange again, to kind of bring back this strangeness where you get so used to, it reminds me too, when Heidegger was like, did you know you never notice a doorknob until it breaks? You use it and you just walk through and you keep going. It's like, it's only when it breaks that you actually look at the doorknob. So there's this idea that use makes things invisible. Like you just stop even paying attention to them because you just use them. Where a child, like I've seen Grace, like look at the doorknob, literally like the door, and just kind of look at it and like trace out the joints and just kind of like play with it. And you never think to do that. You're like, oh, right, there's a doorknob. So childlikeness has, I guess, since children are not habituated to decades of using things, then those things don't become quote unquote invisible to them in their use. And so they become something worth thinking about, something that's worth kind of considering. And that seems to be what childlikeness can do, is actually, the world has a tendency to become invisible as you live it. Everything around you has a tendency to become invisible because it just falls into the background of your routine, the background of your use, the background of what you do. And the philosopher comes along, or philosophical thinking or childlike thinking reminds you, it makes things visible again, right? It kind of starts making doorknobs visible, bookcases visible, the fact that this laptop works visible. It's like, well, what is the point of using a laptop? What is the point of the internet? You start asking these questions of these things you use, and you start going into philosophy. But of course, the dilemma, and this is why I like your work, because you're going kind of back and forth on, you can't escape sub questions, but then that's dangerous because you could become a dogmatist, right? You need iconoclastic thinking, but then again, that could be wild-eyed and burn everything down and could be a problem, right? You could go too far. So how do you find the balance between these things? Because literally, if everything around you was quote unquote visible, like if you really took in all the information of it, you couldn't function. You'd be like the centipede, that is, where the story that Nietzsche tells, where the bug comes along and asks the centipede, how do you use all those legs? And the centipede can't use them anymore, because it's all frozen up. So likewise, if the whole world was visible to you, it'd be too much data. You need things to become invisible in order to function. But once they become invisible, they're invisible. You don't think about them anymore. So, and then the child comes along and makes you realize, like your kids will ask things about appliances or bugs or the porch or nature or rocks that you just forget to even think about because you're so used to them being invisible. And that seems like a good thing. But it is interesting how there really is something about the child that makes the ordinary strange again, and thus can be a subject of focus that one can philosophize about.
Yeah, I've always thought people who say that life is boring, that they're not paying enough attention, you know.
Oh yeah.
I think it's most interesting when someone asks you a why question, especially children, and you actually don't have a good answer because you've never thought about it.
It's hilarious. Well, and boring, you know, boredom is not so much a state where you have nothing to do because there's always something to do. It's a state where you don't see significance in what you could do. You know, there's not, you just don't, of the options that are presented to you, none of them are compelling to you, right? You don't really say, what's funny with children is they're fascinated by a plug. Like Reed will sit and plug in the appliance all day. It's fascinating to him. He's never bored with that. There's something about the iconoclastic, the childlikeness, that precisely in stuff becoming visible, you don't have boredom. Everything becomes a subject of interest. But then the danger can be when things are subjects of interest, you can poke at them and break them. Like, you know, the child who's interested in the electric socket gets shocked, right? Because they don't know the correct boundary to place because they don't use it. So fascination and interest, kind of like Pandora's box, can also pull you into going too far, which brings to mind some of the work that you were saying on the Iconoclast, which again, the Iconoclast is the one who seems to really embody the philosophical spirit. But I took your piece, and I would be curious on your comments on this. I took it to be not necessarily saying that the Iconoclast was all good nor all bad, but it's more like this. It's more like a literary character, and as we know, great literary characters are a mixture of the, you know, good, bad, tragedies, trade-offs of competing good, you know, benefits and different things. Is my assessment of the Iconoclast archetype, if you will, the character, is that, would you say that that's in line with what you were trying to say?
Yeah, I think thinking about it as a literary character is actually quite an interesting way of looking at it. I always thought of it as sort of a intellectual mode of being. Like there's kind of a way you can cognate, right? That could be iconoclastic, and that kind of, you know, there's also, you know, a dogmatic way, which almost is implied by the fact that it has these axioms, right? And again, I'm struggling to pick out what the normative assertion of this work is, if at all. I don't know if I'm going to get to a normative assertion, sure. Because, like you said, there's positives and negatives to thinking in these ways, right? Like, we all know that, you know, dogmatic ways of thinking can, you know, lead to things that are undesirable, but also, you know, as much as I've sort of said that the empirical sciences are dogmatic, they've provided a wealth of utility. So we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. But the one thing I did want to point out with this book, especially, and I'm pretty certain of this, is that I definitely consider it a work of anti-philosophy. And I mean that in the sense that philosophy, as far as we've, you know, hitherto understood it, because, like I said, there's already, you know, I've noticed my shortcomings in terms of what I was educated about Hume and the skeptics, right? There's shortcomings with that, and then there's also the fact that there's a million books called What is Philosophy that never seem to actually, you know, pick up the apparatus of philosophy itself and use it, which is just bewildering to me. And yeah, again, like I'm not sure what the normative assertion is, but I definitely consider this a work of anti-philosophy.
Well, as you're saying anti-philosophy, I think it's desperately needed. Generally, people think of philosophy, and I was speaking with Mr. Jockin on this. What comes to mind is some funny thought experiments involving trolley problems, or these weird scenarios that disprove the existence of, you know, your free will or something like that. Yeah. And so it's just kind of these creations of these scenarios, which, don't get me wrong, they can be fun. And I actually, you know, would point out that these thought experiments tend to make some of the great short stories or literatures or movies, right? Where you sort of enact them. But if philosophy stays in that realm and does not move into creating a spirit of wonder a spirit of paying attention to your phenomenological experience and really being captivated by the very fact that when you look at that door, you see shapes and colors and that they're constructed toward you in a certain way, and that that door brings to mind certain memories, or that in your head you're remembering you need to go to the mechanic later because your brake light is out and you don't like getting a $60 ticket. These things come to mind, that your mind does these things, and just getting kind of in awe of the fact that your whole existence is like this at all times. Like, as I'm sitting here talking with you, I'm splashed suddenly and I'm in a memory of when I was 5 years old, plugging things in just like my son when I mentioned that, and how I did in fact get shocked, and you're just there all of a sudden. Like this whole being that you're undergoing, that you're thrown into, to use those Heideggerian questions. What mode, what discipline would you use to really take all that on, to really tackle it? Literature, science, which one? It doesn't seem like it fits in all those, but when you say philosophy, that seems robust enough precisely because it doesn't seem to be a sub-question to take on the challenge that is yourself. And yet, because of how philosophy is structured very often in academia, it feels more like, that Shakespeare character from Midnight, Pup or something like that, the little imp that's kind of annoying. It feels like philosophy just becomes kind of this annoying imp, as opposed to this life that's really filling in with the wonder, and also taking seriously the fact that at the beginning of everything is a why, and then trying to figure out how to live with that why. I think that is not characteristic of philosophy as we understand it today from academia. So I think it's quite fair to think of your work as anti-philosophy. And in fact, arguably, you can't really do real philosophy unless you also incorporate anti-philosophy, because anti-philosophy itself would be a philosophical endeavor that would be needed in order for philosophy to fulfill itself, because anti-philosophy would require, because that itself would have to harken back to the main question: why do we need anti-philosophy? What is anti-philosophy? So that becomes a necessary corrective for philosophy to even be itself today, especially when it's been taken by academia in certain manners. And I was also going to note, you were saying on literary critic, I always think in my experience, a lot of people who really take on philosophy as wonder, as I suppose we can call it, they tend to be more like literary in their very being, and the way they carry themselves and the kind of lives that they live. There's something about philosophy that makes people themselves more like, characters, like literary characters, kind of deeper, kind of more full. And that's how, I guess at the beginning I was saying there's something about story. You can everything seems to have a story, and everything seems to have a philosophy. And I'm increasingly interested, like a lot of these works, I'm just increasingly interested how making life feel storied, or feeling like you yourself have a story, or that there's some narrative, some story to life. Now, I know we can go too far and get into the postmodern critiques of meta-narratives or something like that, but I think meta-narratives and story can be separated as categories. But there's something about philosophy that brings about a story in one's life and makes things feel storied, and how that actually makes life feel deeper. So it was interesting just reading your work, because I felt like, I think I told you when I was thinking the Iconoclast and the Dogmatist, it made me think of that Hermann Hesse novel where I think it's Goldemon and Narsicus, these two different Jungian archetypes. One is the introvert, the other is the extrovert, and they kind of go on these different stories. So I have this kind of these two characters, the Iconoclast and the Dogmatist, who are trying to learn from one another. And when you say, I think it's generally good not to seek a normative statement, because when you do that, then you almost inevitably have to force your thinking to conform to something. If you discover a normative mode, so be it. But there's certainly something, everyone loves to bring up Hegel's dialectic, but there's something certainly dialectical that emerges between the Iconoclast and the Dogmatist that I think is important, because it would seem, if we go too far in the iconoclast direction, we don't have anything to support us, and we can just fall almost into a kind of nihilism, right? And that's where I'm interested. I wanted to bring up Nietzsche, because people accuse Nietzsche of nihilism, but it seems like more so he's trying to find, he talks about dancing, right? He talks a lot about dancing. He talks about childlikeness, like this kind of ability to somehow walk on water, almost, where you don't have these foundational axiomatic presuppositions, but you're still able to live and to find a kind of deeper life and to find a new foundation on that absence of a foundation. Almost that would be kind of the ideal, and it would seem to me like that's what you need, but you're only going to arrive at that if the iconoclast appreciates what the dogmatist is doing, and the dogmatist appreciates what the iconoclast is doing in their own way. But then, you know, how exactly does one find that balance could be difficult.
Yeah, I think we can go one further in literature and say that I think the iconoclast is very clearly the sort of archetypal trickster, right? It's the one who doesn't want to, you know, say anything for certain and wants to make jokes of everything that seems serious, right? So yeah, I think it's Puck from Midsummer Night's Dream, right? Am I right?
Yeah.
With that?
Yes, it's Puck. That's it. I said like pun or something. It's Puck. Yes.
Definitely a good example. Definitely a good example. If you want to think about it that way, I think that's a good way to think about it. I haven't thought about that before, but yeah, I think again, I don't want to just sound needlessly like, oh, anti-philosophical just because it's cool to be edgy, right? I want to be punk rock philosopher over here, but there's a strange kind of sort of calcification that happened in philosophy once we got past skepticism, because there are now these philosophical schools, right? And I actually can call them out and consider them sub-questions, right? Not to say they're not of utility, but they do presuppose things. You know, you mentioned, at least I think the funniest name I've heard for the trolley stuff is trolleyology. I've always found that quite funny.
I've not heard that. That's hilarious.
But yeah, it seems like a lot of the philosophical schools we have, they're sort of calcified. They've made some assertions, and Hugh mentions the sort of squabbling that goes on between philosophers, right? And it seems to be true, right? Because it's, at least with the sort of university industrial complex, you've just got, you know, paper after paper coming out one after another. And again, to give the example that I'm sort of basing this whole thing around is that, you know, every year I need to look this up, but like every year, how many books and papers do we have that try and answer the question, what is philosophy, right? I was like, where are we going with this sort of thing? And again, I think, like you said, I don't think it is a problem that this doesn't really make a normative statement, because, and that's kind of, it would contradict my thesis, right? I feel like as soon as you make a normative statement, that is to talk about valuing or ethics, you become dogmatic in your thinking. That's a presupposition is opinion, right?
Right.
Metaphysics is opinion. That's once you make an assertion that you get dogmatic. Now, I'm not saying that you want to avoid dogmatism the whole time, but I think this is where Nietzsche's not so obviously connected to the skeptics, but I think he's important here because a lot of his work, especially when we get onto Zarathustra and this sort of stuff, is talking about presenting things and then inviting the reader or the thinker, or however you want to think about them, to make up their own mind about things, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like I almost want to make this thesis with this book without sullying it with my own dogmatism, if that makes sense.
No, well, that's,
we all have that. We all have the dogmatist inside us, right? We all have the one who wants to make an assertion and then squabble for the rest of their lives, right?
well, you had that great part. I think it's in the Dogmatist where you say, you know, if we become indecipherable, we become unbearable or something. And so, you know, there's likewise, we ourselves, if we were utterly indecipherable, we couldn't bear ourselves. Well, to be not utterly indecipherable, there has to be some dogmatism per se, something solid, some standard. And that gets into the question I you know, where we with Mr. Murray on Deleuze and own line of flight and being the only way to avoid capture in society is to be indecipherable. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. But then that comes with such an existential and cognitive cost, because the more indecipherable you become, you may become increasingly indecipherable to yourself, which could be existentially unbearable, and indecipherable to other people, which could make you unbearable. So one of the challenges, if we're taking, and it's a different subject, but if we're taking Deleuze's thinking seriously, is how to get one's own light of flight while staying bearable to themselves. And it may be the case that if you can't do that, that you can't avoid capture, you know, as Deleuze talks about. And what in the world does that mean? And how would we navigate that? But that gets into, I think, when you know, mentioning Hume, I see your work, you know, as you know, I'm quite biased in favor of Hume and adore Hume and all of that thinking. I think a lot of what you're doing is where, you know, Hume is trying to find this balance between where philosophy has a necessary role in common life, in people's lives and the communities that they're in, but does not become this destructive force that kind of undermines it. That just kind of, because, Hume basically wants to point out, he's like, you can always come up with a trolley problem. You can always come up with a thought experiment to undermine people's moral system. Yeah, anyone can do that because philosophy is not bound. It's not precisely your point. It's not bound, it's autonomous. And so it's not bound to anything. Well, if it's not bound to any axioms, then yeah, of course, it can always come up with some scenario that shows that your bound ethics are in fact bound. Well, duh. Philosophy by definition is unbound. All it's doing is unveiling that your morals are bound to certain situations and then suggesting that because your morals are bound to certain situations that they are invalid, as if it was possible to create a system that was not ultimately reliant on axioms that wasn't philosophy itself. You see, only philosophy itself, exactly as you point out, is not so bound. And if everything has to prove itself to philosophy's standard, then everything has to unbind itself, and thus it erases itself. It's negated. It's undermined, and that's where you get the violence that David Hume is one, the philosophical violence that he warns about, that thinkers like Adorno and Horkheimer in the Dialectics of the Enlightenment warn about. So, one of the reasons I appreciate your work is because it's extraordinarily serious to understand that. It has very real socio-political and societal impacts if people do not understand these tensions that are at play. If you live a purely iconoclastic life, then you will undergo a sort of radical decoupling of yourself. It reminds me, bringing back Nietzsche, of you unchain the earth from its sun, right? You're trying to roll this, drink up the entire ocean if you become a pure iconoclast. I think that parable of a madman is exactly where you end up if you're radical iconoclast. Everyone's like, oh God, Nietzsche was celebrating the death of God. No, man, it's kind of like a lament. He's not saying he wants to go back to God, but he's also saying we've really done it now. Our knives are covered in this blood. How are we ever going to be worthy of, of this murder? It's very iconoclastic in my thinking.
Yeah. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. I've always not really liked thought experiments. They've always just felt like rhetoric to me, because it feels like, whoever's got the fastest mind is able to
Yes.
do the smartest thought experiment and able to sort of give you that usually moral dumbfounding, where you don't have an answer.
Yep.
But yeah, you're right. There's this sort of this is sort of the threat that Hume saw to the common life was sort of this unbound rhetoric in a way that was coming out of philosophy.
Yeah, and I mean, for him, if we, for him, he doesn't necessarily want to tell people the way that they should live their life, but he does want to. It's almost like Hume. I don't know if it's a normative statement, but this might be a slight distinct. It's almost an etiquette kind of thing. I almost want to say, where he's like, he's like, look, if you're going to do philosophy, then you yourself need to be committed and bound to some common life, because otherwise you've got an unfair advantage. It's almost like he's like, you're handicapping everyone else. They have to live up to a standard that you don't even hold yourself up to. And therefore it's kind of like, it's unfair. It's almost like it's not good etiquette. It's unfair. It's not, the standards aren't quite right, is what Hume seems to be dealing with.
Yeah. And this is kind of where I'm going with my argument, is that this kind of unbounded iconoclastic way of thinking, way of cognition, very different from, for example, thought experiments, which sort of take this dogmatic position and then cognition just kind of happens from there, right? But in a bounded sense, is kind of what the use of that is to us. Like, who is philosophy for? Is philosophy for us? Because I don't think it's such a certain thing, right? Because I mean, again, I think the people who are tethered to these philosophical schools are most guilty of this, but they sort of, that's one of their dogmatic points within the philosophical schools, right? Is that they take philosophy in itself to be a good thing. And again, go back to Nietzsche, this is one of his great realizations about truth, is that, there's no connection between truth and what we know as good. There are very painful truths we can learn. I don't see why through, the cognitive processes of philosophy, we wouldn't reach the same sort of thing. This unbounded destructive force is up against these very, fragile and fallible beings which is humanity. And I think Hume calls it the contagion of opinion that we're often infected by. And there's this confusion between, free thinking, unbounded philosophy and what actually is dogmatism. And it's interesting because a lot of people who are sort of, again, to use a Deleuzian term, captured, I think that's correct when we're talking about dogmatic ways of thinking, is very often they think of themselves as the free thinkers, right?
Yes.
They think of themselves as the unbounded ones who have seen the truth, and not realizing that, there's not just, the single cathedral of the sub-question, but we're absolutely surrounded by these things. Every ideology has one. Every scientific viewpoint has one. Every philosophical school has one of these things. We're absolutely surrounded by them. And, at least we've got a choice between them, right?
Yeah. Well, I love, so a few things. One, as I understand it, Hume's understanding that philosophy is basically invincible. Like, you cannot stop it once you unleash it, is precisely why it should only be used as a defense against power, or people who would bring philosophy to upend and deconstruct people's way of lives. It has to be used as a defense, but should not be used to try to establish or correct to people, because philosophy, by being unbound, is invincible. And the very fact that it's so effective will function to you as evidence that you must be in the right, when really it might simply just be evidence of the handicap. And so then you go through, you destroy the common life and nothing replaces it with, and you're like, what happened? I thought we were doing the right thing because philosophy was unveiling all these arguments to be wrong. It's like, yeah, it was unveiling them to be wrong because they were all disadvantaged. They were bound, yours won't, by the nature of what philosophy is. So that's why they lost, not because they were quote unquote wrong, but simply because you had a handicap. Like, that's what, like, an advantage. That's kind of how I think about what Hume talks about philosophy. He's like, what do we do with philosophy since it has this like huge advantage that it can't be stopped? And yet it would seem as if we need philosophy to stop the encroachments of power, like to tolerate the king or these different religious wars or different things. So what does this look like? How do we use this power? It's almost, I hate to bring in like nuclear warheads, but it's almost like you build nuclear warheads precisely to deter people from using nuclear warheads, but you yourself don't want to use the nuclear warheads. In the same way, you want to be really, really talented in philosophical skill precisely so that other people don't use philosophy on you, but you yourself don't want to get the philosophical skill to use it on other people. Like, it's almost like it's like a mutually assured destruction thing using philosophy. So, now I have the words, the question floating over the water, and Genesis, and philosophy is mutually assured destruction. And, so we're going to throw out all the images we possibly can. But that's how I see what Hume is saying. He's like, because Hume does indeed suggest that we need to be philosophically skilled, but it's almost like building up your nuclear arsenal precisely so that you don't use it. It's this interesting double action that's hard to get your mind around. That sounds paradoxical, but for me, it makes sense when I think of it as this ultimate force of destruction that then you want to master in order to stop the use of. But certainly, I really love what you're doing on this idea of, we have Heidegger, we have different philosophers asking the question, is metaphysics good? They want to deconstruct metaphysics, but they don't tend to go against philosophy as a whole. They tend to go after metaphysics, but not really ask the question, is philosophy good? Like, why do we assume it's good? How do we know it's good? A lot of people who even ask the question, is philosophy good, tend to be philosophers. So they might be biased. Or if you have scientists saying philosophy is bad, usually their critique is from the outside in, so it tends to be sophomoric. It tends to be naive and not well constructed. But really, to kind of have this open-handed, like, I don't know where I'm going to end up, which I see in your project, but like, is philosophy good? What exactly is it doing? That is a very needed inquiry, because I think that is what Hume and a lot of the counter-enlightenment thinkers, Hartman and different people, Vic, we mentioned Vic, that they're trying to do what they're like, we think philosophy has some kind of role, but it may not be the role people think. And if we get this wrong, precisely because philosophy is so powerful, it could be devastating. So there's like this real imperative to figure out what exactly it is, because if we don't get it correct, precisely because it's quote unquote unbound, the consequences could be a problem.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really hope this is Aristotle and I'm not getting this wrong, but it's always humored me how, it's asking like, what is a good life? And he's like, oh, it's the examined life, you know, it's the one
Right.
who's thinking about things all the time. And it's like, yeah, you would say that, wouldn't you? But yeah, I think your sort of analogy about thinking about mutually assured destruction is pretty apt, because again, this is another connection between, it's weird, I didn't think there was this much of a connection, but through our conversation I've sort of realized there is a bit more between human Nietzsche than we might suspect. As much as Nietzsche really hated the British, but we'll
sure,
leave that to the side, right? But yeah, people have always sort of, again, this comes back to the sort of very light and actually quite, to be honest with you, dishonest and poor reading of Hume that a lot of people are taught, is that he's some sort of closet atheist, right?
Right.
And you can see kind of from a surface level why you'd think that.
Right.
But even in what's supposedly his most scathing work in that direction, The Natural History of Religion, you can see it's got that sort of Nietzschean twinge of death of God to it. It's not necessarily, I wouldn't say it was a lament in Hume's sense, but it is saying like, it's more of saying, okay, what's going to happen now? What do we do now?
Yes.
Sort of thing. And yeah, it's I think, you know, what is intellectually speaking, what is the death of the metaphysical God, the sub-question that we were cozy within? What is the destruction of that intellectually but a nuclear explosion, right?
Yes.
And then all of a sudden, you know, the dogmatists are scattering among the ruins trying to find somewhere else to go, and some of them crawl up into science, and some of them crawl up into I don't know, conspiracy theories or that sort of thing.
Such a good image. They're all crawling. Oh, that's such a good image. I love that.
But it definitely feels that way. And you know, again, you know, God's dead, and some of them, you know, go into some sort of iconoclastic praxis for a bit, like, you know, Nietzsche you can argue that he did, but then you know, you can see the direction Nietzsche was going in, and he's almost sort of, you know, crawled up into his own sub-question based on the axiom of power. And this is kind of where the will to power comes from, I think. It kind of goes to show that there's only so long we can live without our presuppositions, I think.
Right. So a few things. One, Nietzsche is extremely, in my view, in line with the Scottish Enlightenment, which is the underappreciated, misread Enlightenment, as is the counter-Enlightenment that thinkers like Isaiah Berlin and what have you tried to bring out, but, you know, that was kind of left out because it's very humbling. You know, no philosophy department wants to teach, you know, philosophical schools that basically say what they do is limited. You know, nobody likes that. One of the things that happens with Nietzsche and Hume, in the same way that great literary characters like Ivan Karamazov, who I always reference, or they are very easy to misread because what they are doing is so complex. Like you have, you know, that the example I've given is we have that idea from Dostoevsky where we go, oh, you know, if God didn't exist, everything would be permitted. And everyone attributes that to Alyosha. No. Ivan Karamazov's the one who says that in a different way around page 70 or something, where he says, you know, if there was no immortality, there would be no values. You know, Nietzsche says that, and it gets paraphrased later on by Alyosha as if God did not exist, everything would be permitted. Ivan's the one who then does the Grand Inquisitor thing, saying, you know, God, you let there be evil. You know, I'm turning back my ticket. How could you allow this to be? Well, then Ivan actually begins to go nuts because he realizes that God has to exist for him to feel like God got it wrong. You know, like for him to feel like the death of all the children is bad, then there would have to be a God of whom would give him the feeling that dying children is a bad thing. So then Ivan Karamazov, the image is he's always on this fence. He starts hallucinating these images of the devil. Like there's this complexity to Ivan Karamazov. And I believe the Brothers Karamazov was supposed to be book one of a 7-book series called The Great Sinner that was really going to expand on this literary character. So the point is that someone like Ivan Karamazov is precisely because Ivan is dealing with the biggest questions, the most difficult and complex question. It's very easy to just say, oh yeah, he's an atheist. Yeah. Now it's much more complex. In the same way that Nietzsche, I almost want to call them the literary philosophers. Dare I say, like a literary character? Like the truly literary philosophers are so easy to misread or to pin as being a certain way, when really someone like Nietzsche is like, okay, God is dead. What are we going to do? All right, well, we're going to try, you know, a Zarathustra approach. In the middle of that, I'm going to go over to the gay science because I need to keep thinking about that. All right, will to power, can creativity do it? Like they're thinking as they're writing, and they're really wrestling with the gods almost. Likewise, Hume is. Like Hume is this literary person who's saying, all right, so philosophy seems to have a necessary role, but it also is super destructive. And how exactly do we do this in a manner that maintains common life and does not contribute to violence and different things? And when you're dealing with that level of the complexity of thought, these thinkers just seem to be, it's you almost can't get these thinkers unless you yourself have similar thoughts. Like if you yourself have not had similar thoughts to these thinkers, it's almost inevitable that they're going to be misread or put into the wrong camp. And I think a similar thing happens to the great literary characters. Like if you yourself have not gone into atheism and really taken atheism like super seriously, or theism super, like if you've not really taken the idea seriously that a God who loves you exists, who would allow children to suffer, like if you really have not taken that seriously, it's going to be difficult to understand in Ivan Karmazov. So that it's almost like one of the great, I think about this often, like it's almost like you really can't do education unless you yourself have almost already arrived at the goals of education, like these deep thoughts, because you almost can't get the road. It's almost like this Hegelian absolute knowing where you have to see the end ahead of time to even get to the end, and then that's reconstituted. It's this really complex thing. And now that's an entirely different subject. But I think about that often with Nietzsche and Hume and some others, where really what they're doing is you almost are destined to misread them unless you yourself have had similar thoughts.
I've always been worried. I've been worried with this book for a while because I've always thought that it's a little bit, especially like you said, it's a little bit literary at points and a little bit poetic, but I've always thought that it's maybe a little bit too esoteric, and it's not. Some feedback I've had is like, well, what's the point you're making here, right? Like, so I've obviously got to go in, interject, and put some signposts in, but which I think is fair. But there's some things that have happened when I've been thinking about it that I found a bit creepy, because obviously, like I said, there was the original question of like, well, why am I so attracted to philosophy? Like, and then I realized that it had this status, this very special status of being able to interrogate itself, which I definitely got from elsewhere. But then I was like, okay, well, what intellectual modes of cognition can we take when we're looking at these problems? And I was like, okay, the Iconoclast and the Dogmatist, right? And then after that, I started looking into Thoreau, Hume, and Thoreau through Sextus Empiricus. And I was astounded because I thought of Dogmatist independently of reading Sextus Empiricus' account of Thoreau, which is creepy, right? Because I mean, there's some crossover in the accounts, right? Because there's the idea of the Dogmatist I had is a combination of the Thoreauian dogmatist and what he called the academics, which are essentially like truth skeptics, basically. So there was no like truth staters anywhere. And then the Iconoclast seems to overlap with the Thoreauians, basically. But I just thought the fact that word dogmatist is there and present was a bit creepy, to be honest with you. And it kind of made me think that, oh no, I'm not the only person who's thinking like this. I'm not the only person who's ever thought like this.
Oh yeah, well, a lot of the great thoughts, we have this idea that history kind of has this progressive where thoughts build on other thoughts and they entail. And we have this idea that if we learn all the new ideas today, we'll also learn all the old ideas because the old ideas are contained in the new ideas. No. Many old, super important ideas. We also assume that forgotten ideas are bad ideas. There's actually a lot of assumptions we have. We assume that the old is contained in the new, and we assume that the forgotten was bad. Don't get me wrong. As a mental model, as a general rule of thumb, there's probably truth to that. But it's actually really dangerous to assume, because then you just kind of assume that, say, for example, if everyone is telling you that Hume is this empiricist, kind of simplistic empiricist, and you say, well, that's the consensus, therefore that must be the gist of David Hume that I need to know. Well, you've missed out on something very, very important. And if you look back on the ancient thinkers and say, oh, well, everyone's talking about Aristotle and Plato and Socrates, those must be the main three. Those must be the only three that I need to think about. Never mind the pre-Socratics, Democritus, and so on, the Python, these different people. Well, you're really missing out. And you see, and what's really bad is I think this particular line of thought that you're exploring on what should the limits of philosophy be? What exactly is philosophy? And the potential dangers of it and the potential goods as a defense if we follow Hume. Well, it would, of course, make sense that the philosophical institutions would push those aside. They don't want to include those in the criteria because that would be a threat to their own institutional status, right? And so, you really do have to go outside of the preset package of what's considered a philosophical education in order to find the history of this thinking, because of course the package itself, it's only human nature to want to defend your own field of expertise, the field that if you become an expert in, you become powerful or you get status, and all this thinking would be against that. So that's where you get institutions shape the kind of thoughts that are then presented, thinking, philosophy topics that are presented to us as the best, which of course can be an interest into that. And that's where you get into things like Foucault and so on and so forth, which I think has validity.
Yeah. This is kind of one of the issues. And I don't, with this book and just generally, I'm not going to get too like historical about it, because I think it's ultimately not important to the limits of our intellect and sort of the way the zeitgeist is structured intellectually. But with Thoreau, the original skeptic, we don't have anything he wrote. We don't have anything he wrote.
Right.
What we know is we know through Sextus Empiricus, who wrote a book called Outlines of Phronism, and that's kind of our best bet. So again, like in the book, I don't really say, oh, Thoreau said this. I say, the school of Phronism believes this sort of thing, because that's kind of our best bet in knowing. But
right.
In terms of that being the progenitor to this line of skepticism I'm talking about, you can't tell me that what he actually said wasn't important. Like I feel like it was maybe not recognized in his own time. Maybe that's why whatever he said was just completely cast aside. But there's a really long book which I'm going to be referencing, but again, not using too much because it's not really a historical work, is Thoreau, His Antecedents and His Legacy by Richard Bett, where he's just done a great job of just like categorizing like every philosopher before and after and what the possible overlap might be, whether Thoreau went to India, maybe got some of his influences from that. I know that's always a question with like how much of the Eastern influence comes in there as well. But yeah, it's been really interesting just to kind of learn a bit more about how, as much as we think we know everything, or we think our view of history is right and entirely fact-based or this sort of stuff, it's not necessarily true. And again, we're going back to now we're talking about the philosophy of history, right?
Yeah.
Talking about like this is actually a philosophical question already, right? Like, how do we approach history? How do we approach our lack of complete objective knowledge of it? How do we approach the propagandizing of it for various causes, right? Everything comes back to these sort of meta questions, right?
I just had the delight of finishing up a reading group with John David and David Gosley on a thinker named Hayden White. And his whole big thing was talking about how you can never get a science of history, that history ultimately has to be a literary genre, because even you have to ask questions about what constitutes history. What makes a historical account? And then you have to structure history. Well, all of those are going to necessitate certain literary considerations. And then if they require literary considerations, they necessarily also require philosophical considerations to ask why those literary considerations. Like wherever you have a literary consideration, you almost necessarily have to also have a philosophical consideration. And so you can't escape it. And that's why philosophy is so there and so powerful, is because it's almost like it's this thing that's so potentially destructive, just like David Hume warns, and yet so inescapable, right? It's almost like if we follow these Abrahamic ideas of God, you have this all-powerful God that's terrifying, but also inescapable and loves you. This weird relationship. Like I see our relationship with philosophy as having this, you can't really think of it as one or the other. It's because like, how do you relate to a person? Do you just love them? Do you just dislike them? Do you always find them beautiful? Do you always find them, like, people change based on the context, even spouses, right? There are times where they want to be around each other, time where they need to do their own things, different sort of relationships, and it's contextual. It's radically contextual. It's almost like our relationship with philosophy is more like a relationship with a person than it is a field, where it's this very interesting dynamic relationship that we can't just boil down to a linear sort of thing. And it seems to be changing relative to what we're doing in our state of life. It's more like, what's weird is, it seems to me like our relationship with philosophy is more like a relationship with a person than a discipline, which seems unique to our relationship to sub-questions. I'd have to think about this, but our relationship to a lot of the sub-questions don't seem like that. It seems much more linear and straightforward than our relationship to philosophy. And it just reminds me how in theology, the relationship, like if you look at the Torah, some of the characters like God, they worship God, but they're also freaking terrified of God. We need God to be defended from to survive the nations that want to destroy us, but then this God also can turn us into a pillar of salt. Oh my gosh, what do we do? Like, you can't just simply boil God down or Yahweh down to a single characteristic. It seems to be something similar like that with philosophy, which the very fact it is such suggests the immanence, the uniqueness of uniqueness would be the word, uniqueness of philosophy that we need to take seriously. And I was thinking, it's almost like I want to ask with the iconoclast, and I'm not necessarily seeking a normative statement, but it's almost like you want to ask for the iconoclast, what would they be willing to die for? And then with the dogmatist, what would they be willing to open themselves up for? What are the things that would make an iconoclast someone take a stand? What has to happen in their life to make them take a stand? Whereas for the dogmatist, what has to occur to kind of make them realize, oh, fundamentalism can be a problem, where they start to sort of open up. And it's almost like you see what Hume kind of warns about is it's like, well, when the iconoclastic spirit takes over, people don't wake up to the fact that it's a problem until you start having, all of the destruction or the revolutions or the religious war, or it's before his time, but the French Revolution, tearing. Whereas for the dogmatist, it's almost like you don't wake up into that problem until you start seeing the Hannah Arendt banality of evil, where people have that thoughtlessness, where they're just Eichmann used, carrying out their daily task of sending people off to the concentration camps efficiently because it's their job. They're thoughtless. They just, not meaning stupid, but they just do it mechanically, not even sort of thinking about it. And it's almost like in history, you don't realize the possible errors of the iconoclastic, if that's all you do, way of life, until you have that horrific totalitarian violence. But then you don't realize the errors of the dogmatist until you get that banality of evil, that thoughtless evil that defines, say, Eichmann, according to Hannah Arendt. So that was something I was thinking about. And then it would seem, before giving back to you, it would seem like Nietzsche is trying to navigate that space. That's what I just see. Nietzsche is trying to navigate that space. Hume is trying to navigate that space. A lot of the encounter Enlightenment thinkers are trying to navigate that space.
Tricky thing to think about, because it's not so obvious as an institution of a state, for example, or an economic institution or something like this, because the things I'm talking about when it comes to the iconoclast, the dogmatist, the meta questions, sub questions, are all to do with intellectual institutions. They're all to do with groupings of intellect, right? And these things, like you said, they rise and they fall. The Enlightenment, totalitarianism, they have their ebbs and flows, right? And this is kind of where I'm hoping to draw in a, not a direct, but in a slightly creative way, is Albert Hirschman's book, Voice and Loyalty, which is, very overtly relevant to political and economic institutions. But I'm trying to take those mental models as part of the book and relate them to these sort of intellectual groupings instead. I mean, like you said, when does the religiously fundamental dogmatist, when do they abandon their principles, right? When do they vacate the sub question to enter the meta question, obviously only to scuttle back into a different sub question probably, but and I think these things, they almost work like economies, because let's imagine there was a Catholic revival around the world now, right? What that would mean was more people were trying to enter into the sub question, that is Christianity, and then furthermore, more are trying to enter the sub question, that is Catholicism.
Right.
I don't understand how that growing isn't like an institution growing. Again, in the same way, if it was to the fall, these intellectual groupings, they become fashionable and unfashionable. And I think those relate to states and economics in the way that Hirschman describes, not very obviously, but I think they relate. I mean, for example, you've got an intellectual grouping around something like, let's say the original Christianity, which is the union of Catholicism, right?
Sure.
What is all the stirrings and printing of the Bibles in people's, mother tongues. What is that but voice? Hirschman's voice. That's bringing up voice, right? And then, the sub-question in its assertion naturally stamps down on that and starts, torturing and burning people and all this sort of stuff. And then, I don't know, like, I think it's quite obvious to me that, Luther nailing the thesis to the church is very clearly his exit.
Yeah.
Which starts a whole bunch of other people in the sub-question exiting and, forming their own groupings. And it's very obvious with Christianity because of the uncountable number of strains that we've ended up with. So I think there's a relation there between Hirschman's work and what I'm trying to do. But I'm open to push back on that because it's not as obvious as his work with politics and economics.
Well, and a few things on that. Like today, it's not obvious to people that politics and religion need to be married. But for most of human civilization, politics and it was unimaginable that you would not take religious considerations into political consideration. Like we've separated things as we've gone along that maybe you can't separate as well as you think. Like, for example, if you have a certain religious conviction, what does it mean not to vote according to your religious conviction, not to mix your politics and religion? It's kind of nonsensical, right? I guess what people mean is you shouldn't impose your religion on other people. That's what they mean. But to not bring religion to politics almost seems impossible if you take religion seriously, right? So in a similar way, I think Hirschman's thinking can basically be applied anywhere that there's a relationship where you have a kind of loyalty to, there's a sense in which a marriage or a friendship, like a deep friendship, not just an association, is one where you're going to have in the friendship, if you feel like your friend is not being nice to you, you're going to voice it. If you're committed to that friendship, you're not just going to leave, right? You're not just going to exit. Precisely because there's a sense of an emotional connection, those three those ways of thinking that Hirschman is describing are going to be applied. And also too, I think anytime there's an organization, which doesn't necessarily have to be an institution, you will have Hirschman apply. It's that people don't understand. You can have an organization. All institutions entail organizations, but not all organizations of, say, people in their activity is necessarily going to be an institution. But the different strategies, if you will, that Hirschman puts forth would apply just as well, because you're organizing your activity in such a way and therefore investing in that activity and therefore creating some sort of sense of connection with it that's going to make you not want to abandon it easily, but also you could get to a point where you're pressured so much that you feel like you need to exit. And I think the same thing applies to when you get invested in a sub-question. When you get invested in a certain discipline, say science, and the particular science that you've ascribed to perhaps has become scientism, where everything can be understood according to a hard materialist train of thought. Well, then if new data starts to come out that shows, well, I don't know, it doesn't seem like hard materialism can explain everything, or we got the meaning crisis over here, so it seems like we might have to go into other disciplines to get it. Well, if you're super married to that particular way of approaching science, well, you're gonna have a choice. You're going to ascribe loyalty to it, right? You're going to want to hold to it. And if the people inside of it start to be swayed, or your particular grouping that does your scientific investigations begins being swayed against the hard materialist view, you're either going to voice discontent or you're going to leave and find another scientific group that ascribes to the same sub-questions that holds to your presuppositions. So I think you can certainly apply Hirschman's thinking to organizations in general. It's just that what he's describing is more obviously applying to institutions. And I think since most of us are most of the time, our most pressing examples of facing the choices he presents are, in fact, in our institutions, like our job. It's not so evident in our friendships, for example, because usually in our friendships, we are with people that, we don't face those same pressures to want to leave or to stay loyal or to voice. They usually work themselves out much. But the same mechanics would easily operate if you started facing some of the collapses or the declines that you see in institutions. I mean, you see it in families, right? Where people feel, they feel committed to the uncle, they feel committed to the other people, but the other people in the family are maybe not doing what they're supposed to do. And so do they voice, or do they never talk to the family again and they just abandon and they never show up at Thanksgiving? You see similar dynamics. You see those dynamics happen in churches. You see those dynamics happen in beliefs. And I think the way that you're describing everyone, you can't stay in a meta question forever. So eventually you go to a sub question. You take your stand in the sub question, but then if that begins to not satisfy or not fall apart, you have a choice. Either stay in it and see if you can fix the sub question or the parameters of the sub question, go down with the ship, or exit, return to the meta question, the meta question, and then go back to a new sub question and reconstitute the cycle. So I can certainly see that dynamic could work in the context of Hirschman, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, Hirschman does state that his work is a model to be applied to different things. And again, it's not Hirschman's work isn't like particularly empirical, based on anything other than intuition and or like just anecdotal observation from the way things work.
Right.
But the fact that it's had such an effect leads me to think that it's at least useful as a model. And I thought it was, aptly iconoclastic for me to apply it to something completely different. So there you go.
Absolutely. No, I think it works very well. Well, because again, it would seem like Hume, if we use that model, if we're taking Hume and Nietzsche, they seem to understand that hard go down with the ship loyalty to philosophy is not the answer. But then there's something about it where they say, well, you can't ever fully exit, because when you leave the sub question, you just end up in the meta question, which itself is philosophy. So it's like a true exit does not seem to be possible from philosophy. Only sub manifestations, if you will, of philosophy into sub questions can be sort of exited.
We have to make this very clear, though, because Hume does say this, that there's a difference between good, what he calls good and bad.
Good and bad philosophy. Absolutely.
And I feel like it's very clear that, whatever people are calling philosophy, again, this is like a work of anti-philosophy as hitherto understood. Whatever people are calling philosophy is, it's like that attachment to it in itself. That's dogmatic thinking, and that's
bad philosophy.
Hume call bad philosophy, right?
Absolutely.
Good philosophy is this very skeptical philosophy.
Yeah, the great irony is what you refer, like we were talking about earlier, what you're calling anti-philosophy is good philosophy at this point, because of how the pendulum.
It really is bizarre, but I think that's how bad it's gotten.
Yes,
I think that's how bad it's gotten, and I'm very clear in the writing I've done so far, at least, to make it very clear when I'm talking about philosophy in commas, or philosophical schools in commas, or philosophy as in the meta question, the thing we should actually be focused on when we're talking about philosophy.
Yeah, and if we use that language, which exactly right. For Hume, there's a difference between bad and good philosophy. Where today, anti-philosophy is good philosophy, as paradoxical and strange as that sounds. But what's critical to note is it would seem both Nietzsche and Hume understood this, that philosophy had, institutional philosophy had become bad philosophy. So they became anti-philosophical precisely to be good philosophers. And in exploring that good philosophy, there seems to have been an understanding of both that philosophy, in order to avoid some of the various pitfalls that we've described, it has to exist in concert with other things. Where Nietzsche really will start to emphasize the arts and creativity and beauty and different things. And Hume also was very concerned about literature, rhetoric. He also was big on economies, political things. There's this understanding that philosophy has to branch out in order to actually avoid either being overly iconoclastic or overly dogmatic. It has to exist in concert with other entities. Classically, there's this relation of, say, good, beauty, and truth, where, a Trinitarian sort of, you need God is associated with good, beauty, and truth. And what's quite interesting is if you don't get all three, if you say have beauty but not goodness and truth, then beauty becomes a force of destruction and envy, and it attracts people into something bad. If you had goodness but not truth, then you just get good intention, which becomes a force of totalitarian destruction. And if you have truth but not goodness and beauty, well, truth is just axiomatic premises. It's soulless, and it just dehumanizes everyone. So you have to have all three in order to have any of them. Like if you don't maintain all three at all times, then you actually don't get any of them, which is this weird kind of tension. And it seems like something similar is dawning upon Nietzsche. This is where I look forward to your work continuing, and I'm not trying to prime you in a certain direction, but it seems like Nietzsche is realizing something similar, that there's this need for the anti-philosophy that is the good philosophy that also exists in a certain disposition to life, a certain hunger to live. I know he has this famous ammo fati, fates, this kind of like life like really being alive. And that seems to be a necessary condition. I talk about intrinsic motivation, like this real love of life, even to go that far to sort of say, seems to be a necessary component to keep philosophy good. And it doesn't, here's the key, it doesn't, the question is, to what degree can philosophy help you love life and be intrinsically motivated? It seems like it can. If it increases wonder in the way that we were describing, then it might be part of that. But it also doesn't seem, following Hume and Nietzsche, that philosophy alone can do all the work, even if it has a necessary component, some sort of role to play. It seems like you need things external from philosophy. Whereas bad philosophy, I think exactly what you're saying, institutional philosophy would lead you to believe that all you need is to examine life. All you need is to examine life, baby. You don't need, once you examine life, then they'll be happy. Well, okay, yeah, sure. Examining life is nice and all, and it seems important to go to the depths of it and to not make mistakes and to stop totalitarianism and power from oppressing common life. But you might want to dance as well. Nietzsche says, like, you might want to try dancing too.
And I feel like, once you examine something like dance and, you either describe it objectively or pull it apart for where it's not perfect, whatever perfect means, right? Because,
yes.
There's a sort of messy perfection that can happen already. Once you pull it apart into its constituent parts, you lose the whole. And this is where I think that the sort of prompt of the last paragraph in Hume's Natural History of Religion is really important, and just shows that book's not at all really about religion in a way. He says that the whole is a riddle, and that's, I would suggest that the whole is this sort of unwieldy meta question that, short of a metaphysical miracle, we're never really going to understand. We're never really going to understand that, right? So we have to kind of work out what our place is here, right? And I think it's in the riddles and mysteries of life, as messy as they are, because that's kind of our status. And fortunately or unfortunately, it's our status. Because if the whole was explained, it would almost make everything a bit boring, I think.
No, that is magnificent. One of the best, a lot of times we take the word mystery and we think it means something that you can't know, that you can't have any understanding of it. But I always like it, classical understanding of mystery is a thing that the more you understand, the more you find there's more to know, and the more you want to know more. The more you actually want to go deeper and to go further. It's the complete mystery is actually the opposite of boredom. We associate, action with the opposite of boredom. And don't get me wrong, there's truth to that. But really mystery is how you overcome boredom, because it really does give you something to continue to pull you in and that you want to be pulled in. But you don't get mystery in that way if you follow bad philosophy. You have to do the anti-philosophy that you're describing, the good philosophy. And that's the sort of philosophy that is also going to, in a very real sense, humbly acknowledge that it alone cannot give you everything you need in life. It will actually encourage you to go, take those Nietzschean dance lessons, to go take those lessons to be childlike. Well, Mr. Barnes, I must say your work is elegant, insightful, and absolutely thrilling to read. I look forward to, as your project continues, I hope we can do this again to continue on the project. Where can people go to learn about your work? And I also want them to read Missing Axioms, because that was just an amazing text.
Right, yeah, so kind of all my links are on samuelbarnes.com. You can kind of get everything on there. But for this project, the Iconoclast specifically, I'm planning for it to come out early next year.
Great.
And it will be available as a digital and physical thing. So it'll be my first physical book as well. And for these previews that we've been discussing today, which are sort of very abridged versions of certain chapters, if you go to barnes.substack.com, I've been writing over there. You could subscribe and read them all for free. So hopefully sort of whet your appetite for the book.
Well, excellent. No, I love it. And I love your style, and I love your elegance and your insight. And I think what you're describing is incredibly important topics that are extremely urgent and need to be taken seriously, precisely to restore that wonder in life, that childlikeness that I think is so important. Well, Mr. Barnes, thank you so much for your time today, and best of luck with the work.
It's been great. Thanks, Daniel.